What's going on, y'all? I'm Nathan Rich with Southern Salt Kayak Fishing, and today we're talking about inshore fishing spots for catching redfish during a high tide. Alright, y'all, before we dive into it, y'all make sure y'all hit that subscribe button, hit the notification bell, because we got a 6-week series going on where we're going to be breaking down flounder, trout, and redfish. One episode is going to be where to find them in a high tide, and then the next episode is going to be where to find them in a low tide. So we're going to cover all the inshore species, and then the spots that I like to target to find those fish on each tide cycle. So to make sure y'all get to see that, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. Alright, y'all, getting into it. We got a little marsh system pulled up right here, and we're talking about catching redfish in a high tide. Okay, so if we're targeting redfish, there's no better place to target redfish than in the marsh and in these narrow, shallow creeks like what we see right here. And then we got one over here, right? All these little creek systems are loaded. I'm talking about hundreds of redfish in these areas. So what we're going to talk about is the high percentage places to find these redfish and be able to narrow it down and target them, because it would take all day to work all these creek systems thoroughly all the way through, right? So what we want to talk about is how to get in here and identify high percentage areas to catch us a couple redfish and maybe get out if we're in a tournament, or just stay on them, whatever you want to do. So we're talking about high tide, right? The water starts to push on in, all that shrimp, crab, mullet and stuff is getting pushed all the way in the back of these creeks, and that's where they want to go. That bait fish wants to get shallow because that's where it feels safe, right? Especially if it can get up in this grass. Well, the redfish are looking for ambush points. So what we want to do is identify some very good ambush points for redfish to get in and target these fish. So with that being said, we already talked about it. Water's coming in, right? All this stuff like this right here is extremely shallow, is now 2-3 foot of water where it would normally only be 1 foot of water, right? So in a high tide, I want to push all the way back, all the way in the back of stuff like this. So moving in right here, you have this creek that comes in, right? So a very, very good ambush point is going to be right here. So I'm going to make sure, especially in a high tide, I'll make sure that I target this point very thoroughly. But not only this point, it looks like we got us a little cut right here. And what redfish are going to do is get in there, put their head up against that grass, and they're going to wait for something to swim through right here, right? So that's an ambush point. So I'm going to stage up right around this area, and I'm going to cast maybe some voodoo shrimp, some weight baits around these cuts. I'm also going to work this point very thoroughly. I would almost bet that at any stage of a high tide, there's going to be redfish sitting right here. And if you throw a lure in there, you're going to get hooked up. Now, you got this narrow creek right here. I'm going to make sure I hit that mouth, and then moving on in this creek, that's kind of the deal. Yep, these main creeks right here, which I wouldn't consider this a main creek, but in a way it is, because you got little tiny feeder creeks that extend off of it, right? Little tiny narrow creeks. So coming in here, we're going to make sure that we hit these points, and then we hit these little creeks right here. You're going to get redfish that stage up. You got little islands in here. These redfish are going to be butting up all the way up against that grass, looking for that shrimp and stuff to come out of that grass, and they're going to ambush it. So all these little feeder creeks in a high tide are very high percentage areas. And then your redfish will get up in these creeks. It would be extremely hard to try to catch one out of that creek, because that's very narrow, and you're not going to be able to get very good cast accurately down through here without casting all over marsh grass and whatnot. But yeah, all of this up in here is super high percentage areas. And then the same goes with this right here. We might want to come through here, knock out all these little mouths. I mean, this is just a redfish heaven. If y'all have watched a lot of my redfish videos, this is where I'm at in most of them. Y'all see, I catch a lot of redfish in these areas, but if I were just working these channels going along, I wouldn't catch as many, because this is not, in this tide cycle is not a high percentage area. Yeah, you could pick up redfish coming around these creeks and in these bends, but in a high tide, you know, that's not typically where a redfish is going to go to feed. That redfish is going to move in these creeks, stage up around something like this, because all that mullet is moving in here. All that shrimp is moving in here, right? So that redfish is going to stage up right around in here. And then if you creep around those areas, you'll probably see redfish in here tailing, because this is an extremely shallow area. But yeah, that's kind of the deal. Moving around, fishing the mouths of these feeder creeks. Now, we're talking about that high tide, right? There's not a better time, period, to target these fish in here than at the very start of a falling tide. Because what's happening is all this bait that gets put up in these creeks and goes up in this grass, that tide starts to fall and that water becomes a treadmill. Right, and it's forcing them to come out of that grass. That gravity, that pull, that force of the water is forcing that fish that wants to stay in that grass out of there. So that mullet's sitting there, he's struggling, he's fighting against it, and eventually he gets flushed out. He can't fight it anymore. Now, that mullet, bull minnow, shrimp, whatever you want to call it, right, has been fighting against that tide. And when it comes out, it's tired, it's gassed. Well, that makes it an easy target for these redfish. So these redfish will absolutely stage up at the mouths of just about every one of these creeks at the start of that falling tide. Now, once that tide starts to level out and they've eaten and that shrimp's kind of pushed out of there, then it'll kind of die off a little bit. But absolutely, at the start of a falling tide, these creek mouths like this one right here, I mean, you know, just see them. They're everywhere. These fish are going to stage up there. All right, y'all. So we just talked about targeting redfish in a high tide cycle. Next week, we're going to talk about how to target these redfish in a low tide cycle, where to look for them. Whenever they're not in these feeder creeks, where do these redfish go to feed? Well, we're going to talk about that next week. Y'all make sure y'all hit the subscribe button, like the video if it was helpful to you, comment with any questions you may have. God bless, tight lines, and we'll see y'all next time.